Hollywood has always been a dream factory, a place of dazzling gowns, flashing cameras, and red carpets. But beneath the glamour, there was also scandal. During the golden age, long before social media and tabloid websites, actresses could ignite national outrage with a single dress, a single line of dialogue, or even just a knowing smile. These weren't accidents. These were women who deliberately tested the boundaries of what society called decent. They challenged censors, defied critics, and made headlines simply for refusing to be quiet, modest, or obedient. The label that followed them everywhere was one word, vulgar, and yet without them, Hollywood might never have become the bold, daring, and provocative industry it is today. These 20 women didn't just entertain, they shook the system, and in doing so, they nearly brought Hollywood to its knees. Mae West, the original rebel. To understand vulgarity in Hollywood, you have to start with Mae West. The year was 1933. America was in the Great Depression. Audiences needed escape, and Mae West gave them more than they bargained for. While most actresses of her time were cast as pure demure heroines, West played women who were unapologetically sensual. She wore satin dresses so tight she could barely move, delivered her lines with a slow, suggestive drawl, and packed her dialogue with innuendos that made censors squirm. She wasn't just an actress, she was a writer. West wrote her own play, Diamond Lil, which became so infamous that moral groups demanded Hollywood clean up its act. The newly created production code, Hollywood's strict censorship guidelines, often pointed directly at her films as the reason it existed. Boston radio stations banned her sketches, church leaders called her dangerous, parent groups said she was corrupting the nation's youth, and Mae West loved every second of it. Instead of apologizing, she leaned into the controversy. She famously quipped, "I believe in censorship. After all, I made a fortune out of it." And she was right. Every attempt to silence her only made audiences more curious. Mae West turned vulgarity into power. She became a living symbol of female confidence, rewriting the rules of stardom by proving that scandal sells. John Harlow, the platinum bad girl. If Mae West wrote the book on boldness, John Harlow was its glamorous sequel. With her icy platinum blonde hair bleached until it glowed under studio lights, Harlow didn't just walk into a room, she dazzled. MGM marketed her as Hollywood's blonde bombshell, and in films like Red-Headed Woman and Dinner at 8, she embodied unapologetic desire. On screen, she wasn't shy or soft-spoken. She cracked jokes like a sailor, calling men suckers and bosses big boy. This wasn't the polished, delicate language of polite society. This was slang from the streets, rough, raw, and absolutely scandalous for the 1930s. In Red-Headed Woman, she plays a secretary who seduces her boss, slaps his wife, and leaves a trail of chaos wherever she goes. In one infamous scene, she locks a door and throws away the key, making her intentions unmistakable. Critics called it vulgar. Audiences called it irresistible. Off-screen, she lived with the same daring. She wore backless gowns that plunged down her spine, stayed out all night in Hollywood clubs, and gave gossip columnists endless material. Yet her co-stars insisted she was kind, gentle, and professional behind the cameras, a paradox that made her even more magnetic. Newsweek described her as the girl who made sin shimmer. And perhaps that was the secret. Jean Harlow turned sin into glamour, vulgarity into sparkle. Tragically, her story ended too soon. At just 26, she died suddenly of kidney failure, leaving fans shocked and devastated. But her legend lived on, forever frozen in time as the dangerously alluring bad girl who proved that sometimes scandal is the key to immortality. Theda Bara, Hollywood's first vamp. Before Marilyn Monroe, before Jean Harlow, before any of the blonde bombshells, there was one woman who taught Hollywood the power of suggestion, Theda Bara. Born Theodosia Goodman in Cincinnati, she wasn't destined for scandal at first. But when Fox Studios reinvented her, they gave her a name meant to sound exotic, and even spread the rumor that Theda Bara was an anagram for Arab death. Her breakout role came in 1915 with A Fool There Was. In it, she lounges across a deck chair, her eyes rimmed with smoky coal, beckoning a married man into ruin. One of the film's title cards read, "Kiss me, my fool." Audiences had never seen anything like it. This wasn't a damsel in distress. This was a woman commanding men and destroying them. Studio publicists leaned hard into the image. They dressed her in snakeskins and tiger pelts, posed her with occult props, and splashed her across posters as the world's first vamp. The church denounced her. Small-town theaters refused to book her movies, calling her an agent of sin. But trainloads of young fans came anyway, eager to witness the wickedness. On set, Theda was said to be soft-spoken, even shy. But on screen, she was fire, and she lit a torch that every femme fatale after her would carry. By the early 1920s, the vamp image cooled, replaced by carefree flappers. But Bera had already etched her mark. She proved that sometimes vulgarity is nothing more than a woman refusing to apologize for her power. Even in silence, she spoke volumes. Marlene Dietrich, the gender-bending icon. Now, if Theda Bara whispered danger, Marlene Dietrich sang it. Picture this: smoke curling in a Berlin cabaret, a husky voice rising above the haze. Dietrich steps out in a tuxedo, top hat tilted low, singing Falling in Love Again. She was unlike anyone Hollywood had ever seen. When she arrived in America, she carried with her a refusal to obey the rules of gender, fashion, or morality. In Morocco 1930, she performed one of the most scandalous moments in early sound cinema, kissing another woman full on the lips, then tipping her hat to the men in the audience. Censors tried to cut the scene, audiences wouldn't allow it. Her films, from Shanghai Express to Destry Rides Again, dripped with suggestion. She could purr a single line, and you knew exactly what she meant, even if the script never said it. Critics called her immoral. Newspapers labeled her wardrobe vulgar. Dietrich laughed. Clothes, she once said, have no sex. But off-screen, she was just as daring. Her dinner parties were legendary. Caviar served alongside sausages. Aristocrats singing sailor songs beside soldiers. During World War II, she went further, putting on a uniform and traveling to the front lines to sing for Allied troops. To moralists, she was indecent. To men shivering in foxholes, she was courage personified. Dietrich didn't just blur lines, she erased them. She proved that style, charisma, and a refusal to conform could outlast every accusation. The word vulgar followed her for decades, but in the end, it was she who rewrote what Hollywood allure truly meant. Jayne Mansfield, the queen of the wardrobe malfunction. If Marilyn Monroe was champagne smooth, elegant, and bubbling with sophistication, Jayne Mansfield was soda pop, loud, fizzy, and guaranteed to spill over the edge. Arriving in Hollywood in the mid-1950s, Mansfield knew exactly how to play the game of publicity. She made headlines not just for her films, but for her accidents. One night at a dinner party, she accidentally popped out of a low-cut dress, and in that instant, 1,000 flashbulbs went off. The next morning, every newspaper in America had the same photo. She became the so-called queen of wardrobe malfunctions long before the phrase existed. And of course, the word critics used was vulgar. But Jayne leaned into it. In The Girl Can't Help It, 1956, she strolls down the street past milk bottles that explode with foam just by her presence. Subtlety was never her strategy. The Catholic Legion of Decency protested. Britain even banned her cabaret act for indecency. But Mansfield just smiled, packed her pink spotlight, her pet chihuahua named Galena Houdini, and took the show on the road. What many didn't know was that behind the headlines, Jayne Mansfield was brilliant. She spoke 5 languages, read philosophy, and often surprised reporters with her wit. Yet society clung to the image of her gowns, measured in inches of skin rather than yards of fabric. Tragically, her life was cut short in a 1967 car accident. But her legend remains: heart-shaped bathtubs, playful winks, and a reminder that sometimes vulgarity is just another word for having too much fun in a world that takes itself too seriously. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. It really helps us grow and lets us keep creating more fascinating Hollywood stories for you. Hedy Lamarr, the genius they called vulgar. Before she was known as the mother of modern Wi-Fi, Hedy Lamarr was called something else: indecent. In 1933, before she ever reached Hollywood, she starred in the Czech film Ecstasy. In it, she appeared skinny dipping and later in a scene that implied intimate pleasure. For audiences of the time, it was unthinkable. Customs officials nearly banned the film in the United States, and the Vatican condemned it outright as vulgar filth. By the time MGM introduced her to America, studio chief Louis B. Mayer was already warning gossip writers. Yes, she was in a naughty European film, but here she will be a lady. Still, no one forgot that early scandal. On screen, she carried an air of mystery. In Samson and Delilah and Algiers, her smoldering gaze captivated audiences. She embodied a forbidden allure, one that critics couldn't quite separate from her past. But off-screen, Hedy Lamarr's mind was just as powerful as her beauty. During World War II, she co-invented frequency hopping technology, the foundation of today's Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. She was a scientist, an innovator, and far more than a Hollywood sex symbol. Yet reporters constantly ignored her genius, asking instead about her love life and scandalous film debut. Hetty once joked, "Any girl can be glamorous. All she has to do is stand still and look stupid." The irony? She was never still, never stupid, and never truly escaped the shadow of being branded vulgar. Today, she's remembered not just for her beauty, but for her brilliance. Proof that society often focuses on skin while ignoring the mind beneath it. Bettie Page, the pinup who shocked America. Dark bangs, a dazzling smile, a leopard print bikini that became a cultural icon. Bettie Page was the very definition of 1950s pinup beauty, but what made her infamous wasn't just cheesecake glamour, it was the scandalous photos that pushed her beyond the edges of good taste. In a series of low-budget shorts and photo shoots, Bettie appeared in playful bondage themes, leather whips, ropes, and coy grins. They weren't explicit, but for the buttoned-up 1950s, they might as well have been dynamite. In 1957, the United States Senate actually streamed Bettie's short films during an obscenity hearing. Lawmakers clutched their pearls, declaring her work vulgar filth corrupting America's youth. Headlines screamed outrage, but Bettie herself treated it like any other modeling job. A paycheck, a costume, and a smile for the camera. Off-screen, she was the opposite of her wild reputation. She volunteered at her church, baked cookies for neighbors, and lived a quiet life. The contradiction baffled moral crusaders. How could the woman nicknamed the Queen of Pinups also be a devout Sunday school teacher? After she left modeling, Bettie vanished into anonymity, later struggling with mental health before being rediscovered in the 1990s. By then, society had changed. Her once controversial images were celebrated as empowering, and Bettie Page became a cult icon, her face printed on t-shirts, coffee mugs, and runways. What 1950s America called vulgar, later generations embraced as art. Bettie Page's shy grin and playful poses remain proof that scandal often masks a surprisingly gentle soul. Rita Hayworth, the love goddess of suggestion. Few images in cinema are as iconic as Rita Hayworth in Gilda. A dark stage, sultry music, and a single satin glove sliding off her arm. That's it, one glove. Yet, in its time, it was considered one of the most scandalous scenes Hollywood had ever filmed. Critics cried indecency, parent groups labeled it vulgar, some called it striptease by suggestion, though Hayworth never removed more than that single glove. The uproar only fueled her fame, transforming her into Hollywood's ultimate love goddess. Even before Gilda, Hayworth was no stranger to controversy. During World War II, her pinup photo in a black lace negligee decorated barracks walls across the globe. Military chaplains complained the image was lowering morale by raising temperatures. Life magazine, however, celebrated her allure, calling her the dream girl of millions of soldiers. But behind the spotlight, Rita was shy, bookish, and disciplined. Born Margarita Cancino, she grew up practicing dance until her shoes tore apart. She hated the label Love Goddess, once confessing, "Men go to bed with Gilda, but they wake up with me." Hollywood sold her as a fantasy, but Rita longed to be seen as a real woman. Her later life was marked by troubled marriages and, tragically, early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Yet that glove scene in Gilda endures as a masterclass in cinematic seduction, a reminder of how little it sometimes takes for society to stamp a woman with the word vulgar. Clara Bow, the it girl who broke the rules. Long before Hollywood had blonde bombshells or femme fatales, the 1920s gave us Clara Bow, the original it girl. Clara wasn't born into privilege. She grew up in a Brooklyn tenement, surrounded by hardship, yet when she burst onto the screen, she brought something audiences had never seen before. Raw, unfiltered energy. In It Quintime Once Line for Now Show, Bold Time One Sti, the She 20 Tier Dum 27, she played a shop girl who dives headfirst into a department store display just to win the man she loves. She laughed too loud, moved too freely, and spoke with a real-life Brooklyn edge that shocked critics used to polished aristocratic heroines. To young fans, she was magnetic. To the old guard, she was vulgar. Tabloids painted her as reckless. She danced until sunrise at the Coconut Grove, raced her car down Sunset Boulevard, and posed in bathing suits without stockings. Scandalous for the 1920s. Gossip magazines twisted her into a symbol of flapper excess, warning parents that she glamorized immorality, but ordinary women adored her. They copied her bobbed haircut, her bold lipstick, her mischievous grin. Clara was a mirror for a new generation of women who refused to sit quietly and wait for life to happen. When sound films arrived, her thick Brooklyn accent became a target for ridicule, and the press cruelly suggested the vulgar it girl was finished. She retired young, trading movie sets for the quiet life of a Nevada ranch. Yet history has been kind to Clara Bow. What critics once called vulgar, we now recognize as authenticity. She wasn't pretending to be something polished and proper. She was simply herself, and that was exactly why she became unforgettable. Marilyn Monroe, the sex symbol and the burden of beauty. If Clara Bow was the it girl of the 1920s, then Marilyn Monroe was the eternal icon of the 1950s. But behind her luminous smile and soft light glamour was a constant battle with one ugly word: vulgar. In 1951, she wore a gold lame gown so tight she could barely sit down. One columnist called it cheap and vulgar, and the story exploded into national headlines. Monroe's response? She posed for photos in a potato sack, proving that critics would label her indecent no matter what she wore. Her films, too, walked a razor's edge. In Niagara 1953, she played an adulterous wife, her walk filmed in slow motion, so provocative that censors nearly cut the scene. In Some Like It Hot 1959, her beaded dresses seemed painted onto her figure, sparking yet another protest from the Catholic Legion of Decency. But Marilyn had something no censor could erase: vulnerability. Her shy smile and soft voice added humanity to her sex appeal. She wasn't just seductive, she was relatable, a woman whose fragility made her all the more magnetic. Off-screen, she was far more complex than her image suggested. She studied Dostoevsky, joined acting workshops, and wrestled with the burden of being seen only as a symbol. A sex symbol becomes a thing, she once sighed, and I just hate being a thing. The world may have stamped her as vulgar, but Marilyn Monroe remains Hollywood's most enduring star. Her legacy is proof that society often punishes women who control their own allure, even as it immortalizes them for the very same reason. Brigitte Bardot, the barefoot scandal of Saint-Tropez. In 1956, French cinema unleashed a storm named Brigitte Bardot. Her film and God-created woman sent shockwaves through audiences worldwide. There she was, dancing barefoot in the sun-drenched streets of Saint-Tropez, exuding a natural, untamed sensuality that made international censors panic. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned the film. U.S. mayors threatened to ban it. Variety magazine even used the word vulgar multiple times in a single review. Bardot didn't care. When asked about the criticism, she shrugged and replied, "I am immaculate. I have nothing to hide." That was the essence of Bardot, unapologetically free, refusing to bow to society's expectations. Off-screen, she lived the same way. She sunbathed topless years before it became common, fueling endless magazine covers. Paparazzi stalked her every move, desperate for a photo of her breaking yet another taboo. Affairs, marriages, divorces. Everything about her personal life was considered scandalous by the standards of the 1950s. And yet, on screen, Bardot brought more than just shock. Films like Contempt, 1963, showed a deeper, more vulnerable actress. She wasn't simply a sex symbol. She was a mirror of Europe's cultural revolution, a symbol of freedom in love, fashion, and attitude. By the 1970s, Bardot walked away from the spotlight entirely, choosing instead to devote her life to animal rights. The very energy that once scandalized the world now fueled her activism. Her story reminds us that what society once condemned as vulgar often turns out to be the courage to live authentically. Raquel Welch, the fur bikini that shook the world. Sometimes one image is all it takes to define a career. For Raquel Welch, that image was a fur bikini. In 1966's 1 Million Years BC, she appeared on posters in little more than animal skins, and teenage bedrooms around the world suddenly had a new pinup. Critics scrambled for words. Many settled on vulgar. Others called it prehistoric exploitation. But the image became iconic overnight. Her next films continued to court controversy. Myra Breckinridge, 1970, was a wild satire filled with gender-bending humor and outrageous costumes. Time magazine lamented it as tastelessness hitting rock bottom. Again, the blame fell on Raquel, even though she had little control over the production. But Welch wasn't just a poster. In The Three Musketeers, 1973, she proved her talent with comedic timing and action flair, winning a Golden Globe. Still, critics often focused less on her acting and more on her figure. Off-screen, she challenged the double standard directly. "If men can bare their chests in films," she once said, "why shouldn't women show their shoulders?" She also stepped into the world of fitness, releasing best-selling workout videos in the 1980s. Even then, TV hosts dismissed her leotards as too daring for breakfast television. Yet, through it all, Welch carried herself with grace. Behind the fur bikini and the media circus stood a woman determined to be more than just an image. She wielded her beauty like a weapon, not to shock, but to carve out her own space in a world that constantly tried to define her. Sharon Stone, the leg cross that stopped the world. 1992, a single movie scene forever changed Sharon Stone's life and Hollywood's idea of controversy. The film was Basic Instinct. The setting, a police interrogation room. Sharon Stone sits coolly in a white dress, surrounded by detectives. And then, in one brief moment, a casual leg cross cinema history was made. The scene lasted seconds, but the reaction lasted years. Newspapers screamed about gratuitous vulgarity. Politicians debated censorship. Some theaters slapped adults-only warnings on posters, even though the movie carried an R rating. Overnight, Stone went from a relatively unknown actress to the most talked-about woman in the world. Critics called it sleazy, but Stone defended the role. She argued that her character Catherine Trammell wasn't just an object of desire, she was a woman controlling the entire room of men, turning their gaze into her weapon. It was power, not weakness. The label of vulgar stuck, however. Later roles in Sliver and Casino kept her reputation as Hollywood's boldest risk-taker alive. But away from the screen, she revealed a different side, a survivor. After suffering a near-fatal brain hemorrhage in 2001, she turned her attention to philanthropy and advocacy, especially for brain injury awareness. Sharon Stone's story is proof of how one provocative choice can define a career. Hollywood painted her with broad strokes. Daring equals indecent, mystery equals menace. Yet through resilience and intellect, she outlasted the scandal. Today, that infamous scene is remembered less as vulgarity and more as one of cinema's most iconic moments of power. Elizabeth Berkley, from teen star to career suicide. If Sharon Stone's controversy made her a star, Elizabeth Berkley's nearly ended her career. In 1995, she stepped into the lead role of Showgirls. Just a few years earlier, Berkley had been the wholesome Jessie Spano on the teen sitcom Saved by the Bell. Audiences knew her as the smart, ambitious girl next door, which is exactly why Showgirls hit like a thunderclap. The film was raw, provocative, and unapologetically explicit. Berkley played Nomi Malone, a dancer clawing her way to the top of Las Vegas. The critics didn't just dislike it, they destroyed it. They called it trash, sleaze, vulgar carnival. One review sneered that Berkley had committed career suicide on celluloid. Even U.S. senators referenced Showgirls in debates on pornography ratings. Late-night talk shows mocked her mercilessly. Studio doors closed. Virtually overnight, Elizabeth Berkley went from rising star to Hollywood pariah. But she didn't give up. Instead, she reinvented herself. She found new life on Broadway and in cabaret. More importantly, she began advocating for young performers, launching self-esteem workshops to help others navigate the harsh world she had faced. And then something unexpected happened. Showgirls didn't die. Over the years, it gained cult status. Audiences began to see its over-the-top style as satire, celebrating it for the very excess that critics once hated. Berkley herself returned to embrace it, even appearing in documentaries about the film's legacy. In the end, what was once labeled vulgar came full circle, not as shame but as camp legend. Her journey is a reminder that Hollywood's judgments often say more about the culture of the moment than the performer. Time has a way of rewriting what scandal means. Madonna, the queen of provocation. If there was ever a star who thrived on being called vulgar, it was Madonna. By the early 1990s, she wasn't just a pop star, she was a cultural force, and she knew how to stir outrage better than anyone. In 1992, she released her infamous coffee table book simply titled Sex, filled with provocative images of bondage, nudity, and roleplay. It sparked bookstore boycotts and moral outrage. Newspapers branded it vulgar filth. The result, record-breaking sales. Then came Body of Evidence, 1993, a film dripping with candle wax, handcuffs, and sexual games. The MPAA slapped it with an NC-17 rating. Critics said she had dragged Hollywood into the gutter. Madonna just smirked. This was the reaction she had been playing with her entire career. But while the controversy swirled, people overlooked her quieter performances, desperately seeking Susan and A League of Their Own, roles that proved she had real acting ability. Instead, headlines focused on the spectacle. Because scandal sold, Madonna herself defended her choices, saying women had every right to explore desire and power dynamics on screen, just as men had done for decades. To her, vulgarity was never an insult. It was a tool, one she wielded to provoke conversation, break taboos, and claim agency over her own image. Today, compared to the extremes of modern streaming dramas, her 1990s controversies seem almost tame. But at the time, Madonna wasn't just shocking the public. She was rewriting the rulebook of female sexuality in entertainment. Pamela Anderson, running in slow motion. Few images are as instantly recognizable as Pamela Anderson sprinting down a beach in a red lifeguard swimsuit. With Baywatch, she became the 1990s ultimate sex symbol, watched weekly by over 1 billion viewers around the world. But while fans adored her, critics sneered. They called the show slow-motion vulgarity in prime time. Her film roles like Barbed Wire 1996 and Raw Justice only amplified the backlash. Reviewers dismissed them as cheap, trashy, or soft-core disguised as cinema. Pamela, however, insisted she owned her image. She pointed out that male action stars flaunting their muscles in swim trunks weren't branded and decent, so why was she? For her, the double standard was obvious. Behind the glamour, Pamela was more complex than tabloids ever admitted. She became a high-profile activist, campaigning for animal rights with PETA, speaking to legislative bodies not in bikinis but in suits. She fought publicly for causes she believed in, yet the media continued to reduce her to one word: vulgar. Decades later, her candid memoir reframed her story. It revealed a childhood marked by trauma, a young woman manipulated by the industry, and a survivor who turned exploitation into advocacy. Pamela Anderson's arc shows how vulgarity is often just the frame society forces onto women who dare to profit from their own beauty. For her, that red swimsuit wasn't a scandal, it was a symbol of survival, resilience, and control over her own narrative. Kim Basinger, the ice and fire of desire. In 1986, dim lights, sultry jazz, and a single ice cube turned Kim Basinger into one of Hollywood's most controversial stars. The film was 99 Weeks, a story of obsession and erotic games. Basinger, opposite Mickey Rourke, delivered a performance that critics couldn't look away from, and many didn't want to. The infamous ice cube scene became shorthand for cinematic excess. Reviewers labeled the film soft porn, masquerading as art. Churches warned congregations against seeing it. City councils even weighed bans, and one word appeared over and over again: vulgar. Before this, Basinger had played ingenue roles, charming and delicate, but 99 Weeks shattered that image, thrusting her into the role of Hollywood's most daring seductress. She had crossed a line, and critics made sure the world knew it. Yet, Basinger was more than controversy. Just a few years later, she shocked Hollywood again, not with scandal, but with ambition. She bought an entire town in Georgia, hoping to transform it into a movie hub. The press ridiculed her, calling it tacky extravagance. Financial struggles followed, and she declared bankruptcy. But like all great stars, she fought her way back. Her comeback came with LA Confidential, 1997. This time, she played a call girl modeled after Veronica Lake, bringing depth, dignity, and quiet strength to the role. The performance won her an Academy Award, proof that the same actress once mocked as vulgar could also deliver cinematic greatness. Kim Basinger's story is a reminder that scandal may define a chapter, but talent can define a lifetime. Angelina Jolie, the wild child who became a visionary. By the early 2000s, no one embodied Hollywood boldness more than Angelina Jolie. On screen, she captivated audiences in films like Original Sin, 2001, a steamy period drama filled with candlelit love scenes that critics dismissed as sweat and vulgar excess. But off-screen, Jolie was just as notorious. She openly discussed her tattoos, wore vials of blood as jewelry, and kissed her brother on the red carpet. The tabloids pounced, branding her Hollywood's most indecent star, but Jolie wasn't interested in being polite. She was fearless, raw, and unashamed. She spoke about love with an honesty that unnerved reporters. She lived fast, loved loudly, and broke every rule of what a respectable Hollywood actress should be. Then came the transformation. Jolie began channeling that same fearless energy into humanitarian work. She adopted children from war-torn regions, served as a UN ambassador, and lobbied world leaders for refugee rights. Slowly, the narrative shifted. The woman once called vulgar became a global visionary. The tattoos, the blood vials, the scandalous interviews, they faded into the background. What remained was a woman of immense talent and compassion who had evolved before the world's eyes. Angelina Jolie's story shows Hollywood's fickle nature. What shocks in one decade can inspire in the next. Sometimes the wild child isn't vulgar at all. She's simply ahead of her time. Monica Bellucci, elegance in the face of outrage. In 2002, at the Cannes Film Festival, a single movie caused audiences to flee the theater in shock. The film was irreversible, and at its center was Monica Bellucci. The movie contained one of the most harrowing and unflinching scenes of violence ever filmed. Some viewers called it cruel, obscene, even unwatchable. Headlines branded Bellucci vulgar for daring to take part in such raw storytelling, but Bellucci defended her choice. For her, the film wasn't about shock for its own sake. It was a brutal warning about violence and the fragility of life. Cinema, she argued, must sometimes confront darkness rather than pretend it doesn't exist. This wasn't the first time she blurred the line between art and scandal. In Milena 2000, she played a woman whose beauty made her the obsession and the target of an entire Italian town. Critics called the performance sensual, daring, and yes, indecent. Yet audiences couldn't look away. What made Bellucci unique was that she refused to be reduced to her allure. Fluent in Italian, French, and English, she often quoted philosophers in interviews. She balanced blockbuster roles in The Matrix Reloaded with independent European dramas. Age never dimmed her appeal. She became one of the few women in Hollywood celebrated as a sex symbol well into her 50s. The label Vulgar followed her for daring to embody both elegance and raw sexuality. But over time, critics softened, acknowledging that her courage redefined what sophistication could look like. For Monica Bellucci, beauty wasn't weakness, it was strength, even when the world recoiled. Mamie Van Doren, Hollywood's blonde rebel. If Marilyn Monroe was champagne and Jayne Mansfield was soda pop, then Mamie Van Doren was pure rock and roll. In the 1950s, Universal Pictures marketed her as their answer to Monroe and Mansfield. But Mamie wasn't interested in subtlety. She strutted onto screens in tight sweaters, shook her hips to early rock music, and starred in films that reveled in teenage rebellion. One of her most famous was Untamed Youth, 1957, where she sang and danced her way through a story of farmhand chain gangs and delinquent rock numbers. Reviewers sneered, calling it corny, noisy, and occasionally vulgar fun. Church bulletins warned that Van Doren's films glamorized bad behavior and juvenile delinquency. Teenagers, of course, loved every minute. Off-screen, Mamie leaned into the publicity. Universal gave her a champagne gold convertible for parades and stunts, instructing her to wave and blow kisses like a walking headline. She became known for her playful one-liners, once quipping, "Delinquent? I never even got a parking ticket, just hearts." Like Mansfield, she cultivated an image of scandal, but in truth, she was far sharper than tabloids suggested. She performed for US troops in Vietnam, cracked clean jokes during her shows, and later embraced her bad girl reputation with humor. Today, Mamie Van Doren looks back on her career with pride, laughing that what once seemed scandalous now feels positively tame. Her story is a reminder that vulgarity is often just another name for fun, especially when you're a blonde bombshell rewriting the rules of 1950s Hollywood. From Theda Bara's silent smolder to Sharon Stone's leg cross, from Betty Page's bondage grin to Pamela Anderson's slow-motion beach run, these 20 women all shared one thing in common. They pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. The word vulgar was used to shame them, to keep them in line, to remind them they had gone too far. But in truth, each time the line moved, Hollywood itself moved with it. These women didn't just break rules, they built new ones. They proved that scandal isn't always shameful. Sometimes it's just society catching up to those who dare to live authentically. And that's the vintage legacy of Hollywood's so-called most vulgar stars, women who turned outrage into art and scandal into legend. Which of these stars do you think was the boldest trailblazer? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this dive into old Hollywood's untold stories, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more forgotten scandals, legendary stars, and the secrets behind the silver screen. After all, history is never as polite as we remember it.